Imagine, on Red Dress Day of all days, the federal minister Carolyn Bennett says her heart is with the families and survivors of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and that more work needs to be done. You think? Indigenous women and girls are literally dying. It's been almost 2 years since the National Inquiry found Canada guilty of genocide. Thoughts and prayers are not going to cut it anymore. May 5th is National Awareness Day for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls in both Canada and the United States. That's because in both countries, many thousands of Indigenous women and girls continue to be abused, neglected, exploited, traded, kidnapped, disappeared, and murdered. This isn't a new phenomenon. This has been going on for generations and is the core foundation of both Canadian and American genocide against our sovereign native nations. While both countries engaged in widespread and sustained acts of genocide against all native peoples, settler governments took specific aim at native women and girls in a form of gendered colonization, treating them as exploitable and expendable. Colonial governments, institutions, and industries have treated Indigenous lands and bodies as exploitable resources. And the rape of Indigenous lands and bodies became deeply ingrained in state laws, policies, practices, economic and governing systems, and sadly, in some segments of society. And no, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a well-intended policy gone wrong or an inevitable clash of cultures. This was a well-funded campaign of genocide that has still not ended. Here in Canada, Indigenous women and their families advocated for a public inquiry into the high rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The National Inquiry, which included the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, commenced in September of 2016. At the time, Minister of Indigenous Affairs Carolyn Bennett promised the families and survivors that Canada would not wait until a final report before they took urgent action to end the crisis. Not only did Canada fail to take urgent action, but we are almost 2 years after the National Inquiry's final report, and there is still no national action plan to urgently end genocide. And yes, I said genocide. The National Inquiry found Canada guilty of both historic and ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples that specifically targeted Indigenous women and girls in a form of gendered colonization. This is not an academic opinion or political rhetoric. That is a legal finding based on the United Nations Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. In the convention, genocide occurs when a state has the intention to destroy a specific group like Indigenous peoples in whole or in part. And this can happen in one of 5 ways. Killing Indigenous peoples, causing physical or mental harm to Indigenous peoples, creating the conditions of life meant to bring about their destruction, the prevention of births in Indigenous peoples, or the transfer of Indigenous children outside of their communities. The National Inquiry found Canada guilty of all 5. Now let that sink in. Canada is guilty of knowingly and intentionally committing genocide against Indigenous women and girls. They found, and I quote, Canada's colonial history provides ample evidence of the existence of a genocidal policy, a manifest pattern of similar conduct which reflects an intention to destroy Indigenous peoples. It went on to find that Canada has displayed a continuous policy with shifting express motives, but an ultimately steady intention to destroy Indigenous peoples physically, biologically, and as social units. The National Inquiry considered the following as examples of genocide: failing to protect Indigenous women and girls from exploitation and trafficking, failure to protect them from known killers, the taking of our children from Indigenous women and girls and placing them into foster care at high rates, physical, mental, and sexual abuse of Indigenous women and girls in state institutions, from residential schools and Indian hospitals, to prisons, group homes, detention centers, and mental health institutions. the denial of Indian status and band membership to First Nation women and children, the forced and coerced sterilizations and abortions of Indigenous women and girls, and the purposeful chronic underfunding of essential human services like food, water, healthcare, education, and housing. Add to this the high rates of violence and exploitation that results from the man camps associated with the extractive industry and the widespread sexualized violence committed by police forces in every province and territory. And you can see just how genocide continues. When the report came out, Prime Minister Trudeau said he accepted the finding of the National Inquiry. So, where are we now? Well, the brutal truth is that we are no further ahead than we were 5 years ago before the National Inquiry started. The National Inquiry recommended a comprehensive national action plan involving federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal and Indigenous governments to stop the genocide and protect Indigenous women and girls. But more importantly, they said that this plan should be led by Indigenous women and their chosen representatives. So despite all of the thoughts and prayers from politicians, has the federal government moved with urgency to end genocide? That's the question. And the very clear answer is no. It's been almost 2 years since the National Inquiry released its report recommending this national action plan, and we have nothing. The Trudeau government has issued multiple budgets since being elected without a single mention of genocide. The National Inquiry found that sex discrimination in the Indian Act is a root cause of violence against First Nations women and children. Yet, despite the legislative amendments made 2 years ago, Canada has failed to register these women, denying them access to critical pandemic supports. And the incarceration rates of Indigenous women and girls are soaring with no end in sight at a time when they should be decarcerated. Canada is fighting First Nations children in foster care in court, trying to deny them compensation for years of lost childhoods and cultures. And they are still fighting residential school survivors from St. Anne's. It seems that on every level, Canada is continuing genocide against Indigenous women and girls. How many more Indigenous women and girls need to go missing or murdered before the federal government will address the crisis for what it is? An urgent national genocide that needs urgent action to end it. And Canadians, we need you to step up and do your part to pressure governments to end the genocide now. I'll also post a link to my article for Canadian Dimension magazine, which is my analysis of the most recent federal budget and their failure to include a national action plan to end genocide with specific and sufficient funding to do so. And here's a little hint. They paid far more for Trans Mountain Pipeline than they have to address genocide against Indigenous women and girls. Thank you all for watching my channel. Don't forget you can find all of this information on my website, www.pampalmater.com. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.